Okay, hello everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Welcome, thank you so much for joining us for this SPICE webinar today. As you know, we are here in recognition of Human Rights Day 2020, and today's topic is Global Human Rights and Minority Social Movements in Japan. And we're thrilled to have Professor Kiyoteru Tsutsui of Stanford here with us today. Before we begin, just allow me to introduce myself briefly. My name is Naomi Funahashi, and I focus on professional development initiatives for teachers at SPICE, and I also teach online. I teach an online course called the Reischauer Scholars Program, which is an online course that we offer to high school students in the US about Japan and US-Japan relations. I think that many of you are familiar with SPICE, but for those of you who are not, let me just tell you a little bit about what we do. So SPICE stands for the Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education, and we're a K-12 sort of education outreach arm of the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies. SPICE serves as a bridge between the research and scholarship that takes place at FSI and K-12 and community college schools and students and educators. And our goal is to try to make this high-level scholarship that's taking place at the university and to make it accessible and relevant to a K-12 and community college audience in order to present multiple perspectives and enhance critical thinking skills in social science classrooms. So we work primarily in three areas. One is multidisciplinary curriculum design on international topics. The second is online teaching to high school students in the United States and Japan, and then also recently with a new course that we've started to students in China. And then of course, we also offer teacher professional development. It's typically been through in-person workshops. Now, we've all pivoted to online offerings, but we try to take a lot of the curriculum materials that we have and to sort of model how to use them in the classroom. So before I continue, I just want to really thank everyone for taking the time to join us in this webinar today, and also for taking the time to reflect upon global human rights and why this is an important topic for us to teach about in our classrooms. We also recognize and really acknowledge that there is definitely an over-proliferation, I would say, of webinars and Zoom time for everyone these days. So it means a lot to us that you're here. Okay, so let's set the context for this webinar and talk a little bit about why we're all here today. The terminology human rights is relatively new, having been brought to the conscience of the global community by events following the end of World War II, namely the founding of the United Nations, of course, in 1945, and the subsequent adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on this day, 72 years ago, December 10th, 1948. So, this is reflected, right, it's reflective of the growing global commitment to the protection and recognition of what is now referred to as human rights. The UN's 2020 Human Rights Day theme is focused on recovery. Very appropriate, right, in this COVID-19 era. And it's really a call to action for all to stand up for human rights and to focus on recovery efforts in a way that considers the importance of creating equal opportunities for us all, to address the failures that are exposed and exploited by COVID-19, and to apply human rights standards to tackle systemic inequalities and discrimination around the world. And if you go to the UN's website, you can find more information about Human Rights Day and the ways in which human rights are really at the heart of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals toward achieving a better and more sustainable future for all. There's also a student resources page under the Learn More tab on the UN's website. So I encourage you to go there and check out some of the multimedia resources they have available. I mentioned earlier that one of the focus areas for SPICE is in curriculum design and development. So all webinar registrants will receive an email in about a week from us in which you'll receive a link to download a PDF of lesson 1 of the SPICE curriculum unit, examining human rights in a global context. So lesson 1 guides students through a series of activities that introduce a basic definition of human rights and then builds upon that definition to study specific issues, some controversial, that are discussed in the international human rights discourse today. A link to download the PDF of the lesson will be emailed to everyone, along with a video recording of this webinar. So before I continue, I want to just send out a few words of thanks to our partners and colleagues around the university that made this webinar possible today. So Noah Ronkin at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, where today's speaker, Professor Kiyoteru Tsutsui, is the director of the Japan program. Daphne Zur, John Groschwitz, and Ekaterina Mojeva at the Center for East Asian Studies at Stanford. Our colleagues at the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia, who are all around the United States. And finally, to the SPICE staff who are helping out today. So thank you to Gary Mukai, our SPICE director, and Rylan Sekiguchi, manager of SPICE's curriculum and instructional design, for their support today in managing the chat and Q&A. It really takes a village, so thank you. And finally, just a couple housekeeping issues. As attendees in this webinar, of course, your video and microphones are off. This session is being recorded. As I mentioned, we'll provide the recording link to you in about a week. And please direct your questions to the Q&A tab in the menu bar. And we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible following Tsutsui Sensei's talk today. So please pose your questions there, and we look forward to talking about them. Okay, so I will next introduce Professor Tsutsui, and after his 45-minute talk, we'll address questions that are submitted in the Q&A, as I mentioned, and then we'll close this webinar by 5:30 p.m. Pacific time. Okay, so Kiyoteru Tsutsui is the Henry Tomoe Takahashi Professor and Senior Fellow in Japanese Studies at Shorenstein A Park at Stanford University, where he is also the director of the Japan program, a senior fellow of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and a professor of sociology. And prior to his appointment at Stanford just this past July, he was professor of sociology, director of the Center for Japanese Studies, and the director of the Donia Human Rights Center at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. His research interests lie in political and comparative sociology, social movements, globalization, human rights, and Japanese society. More specifically, he has conducted cross-national quantitative analyses on how human rights ideas and instruments have expanded globally and impacted local politics. And he has executed qualitative case studies of the impact of global human rights on Japanese politics. His research on these subjects has appeared in numerous academic publications and social science journals. His recent book publications include Rights Make Might, Global Human Rights and Minority Social Movements in Japan, which he'll be talking with us about today, and also the co-edited volume, Corporate Social Responsibility in a Globalizing World. He has been the recipient of numerous prestigious fellowships and grants and awards. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Kyoto University, and then earned an additional master's degree and PhD from Stanford's Sociology Department in 2002. So we are thrilled to have Professor Tsutsui back at Stanford now, and it is an honor to feature him on this webinar, in particular on the 72nd anniversary of the signing of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So Tsutsui Sensei, without further ado, if you could turn on your camera. And I will stop mine, and thank you for joining us today.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Naomi, for the kind introduction, and thank you to Naomi, Gary, and Rylan for the opportunity to present my work at this esteemed forum. I'm really deeply honored to be speaking to you today on the Human Rights Day, 72 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. As Naomi eloquently described, UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was the first major milestone for universal human rights in international society. And even though it's not a binding treaty, the principles enshrined in the document elevated the expectations of many in the world, especially those who are marginalized and subjugated, and empowered them into collective action to promote and protect human rights across the globe. And I hope to demonstrate in my presentation today the importance of this understanding of the idea of human rights. And I understand that most of the audience today are high school teachers. And I really am delighted that you take the time to join us. And I hope that some of what I say today is useful, and hope that you will bring some of that back to the classroom. It's really critically important for the young generation to understand the principles of human rights at the really the formative age of teenage days. I hope that there's something helpful in my talk today. So the talk is based on a book, as Naomi mentioned, about the history of the three minority groups in Japan since the 1970s. And let me share my screen with you to get started. Right. And I just want to start with a quick thumbnail sketch of the history of the three groups. And I'm going to dig deeper into the first two, but I just don't think I have time for covering all three. So you might think of Japan as a homogeneous nation. A lot of Japanese think of it that way as well. But there are some minority groups, and these are the three most salient minority groups that have been in existence in Japan since the end of World War II. And the first one is Ainu. They are an indigenous people in northern parts of Japan. And throughout the period of Japan's modernization and up until really the 1960s and 70s, they were seen as a group, an ethnic group that would be assimilated into mainstream Japanese society. So they were often labeled as a dying race. But since the 70s, things changed quite a bit for them. And by now, they are recognized officially by the Japanese government as an indigenous people of Japan, of the northern part of Japan, which is a far cry from where they were, even back in the 60s. So what happened in the 70s, right? And I'm going to say a little much more about that soon. The second group I examine in my book is Koreans in Japan. They are they're called Zainichi in Japanese often. And they are a sort of colonial legacy group. And after the war, they became basically a stateless group. And their very existence in Japan was always very precarious. And they engaged in some activism, but it was not really successful up until the 70s. Fast forward to today, they have gained many more rights since the 70s. And I wouldn't say their existence is perfectly happy and stable, but compared to where they were before the 70s, they have made considerable strides in their political pursuit of rights. The third group is Burakumin. It's a much bigger group. Ainu, in terms of the number of people, about 30,000 self-identified members. In Hokkaido, northern part of Japan, northern island of Japan. Resident Koreans are somewhere around 600 now, down more to 450,000, but not that big. Burakumin, there's no census data on this because the Japanese government take any census, but it is said that there's at least about 3 million Burakumin. So that they're formed already by the 70s, a very formidable voting bloc in Japanese politics. So there were a minority group in Japan that actually did have some success before the 70s. And fast forward to today, they transformed themselves into more of an international human rights organization going around the world, spreading the gospel of human rights and trying to help other minorities in the world, especially in Asia. That also, that transformation, which I don't have time to discuss today too much, but I'm happy to say a little bit more in the Q&A section, also took place since the 70s. So the question is, why the 70s, right? Why have all these three groups in Japan expanded their activism and made significant strides since the 1970s? That's the starting point of my inquiry. And people typically look at domestic factors in thinking about how the fate of minorities and the vulnerable populations changed over time. And I looked into that, and in Japan, there's really not much that would explain the change in the way those three groups operated. So I looked outward, critically to international society, international environment, and identified human rights, the expansion of human rights and spread of these ideas, and the Japanese government's participation in international human rights regime as a key component in explaining the changes among those three minority groups. And global human rights, right? So global human rights is, as I said, started in 1948. It was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was a critically important document because it differs from what preceded in many different ways, especially in two ways. One, that it's universal, and people have human rights just for being humans. You don't have to be white, you don't have to be men, you don't have to be Christian to deserve rights. It's for everybody, every single human being. Two, it sometimes, not always, but sometimes overrides state sovereignty. Violating governments can no longer, in theory at least, no longer hide behind the cover of domestic affairs, right, and state sovereignty. So it was a radical departure from the international norms before 1948 in those two regards. And that document turned into two key international human rights treaties in 1966. Those two treaties, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, were adopted in 66. Enough number of countries ratified by 76. So these two treaties entered into force. So scholars of the history of global human rights debate about the key moment in the history of global human rights. And a lot of people point to the late 1940s because of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Others point to the 70s. Of the Carter administration's critical importance, President Carter's commitment to human rights, and also the Helsinki Accord that loosened the grips of East European countries on the population's civil and political rights. Some argue that the 90s, the post-Cold War era, is also critically important. But those debates continue, but clearly, it's a gradual process, somewhat spasmodic, but gradual process since the 1970s and 1940s. And the 70s was critically very important. And I don't mean these charts to be readable. These are just to give you an idea of the evolution of human rights institutions, like the number of human rights treaties, international human rights treaties, the number of countries that have ratified these key treaties, the number of international human rights NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and the number of times that the term human rights was used in popular media. So by any metrics, human rights have expanded since the late 40s, especially since the 70s, and now established as a key, one of the key principles in the international community. Now, I think a lot of people agree that human rights are recognized as important international norms, but whether all this process of institutionalization of human rights in international society has done what it's intended to do is debatable. So there's been some heated debates on the efficacy of international human rights regime. And some argue that all these instruments have served their purpose of promoting the idea of human rights, but they actually haven't had a lot of impact on the ground in terms of actual practice of human rights. So people like Steve Hopgood, Eric Posner talk about end times of human rights or the twilight of human rights law, meaning human rights treaties. Others argue that those naysayers are somewhat short-sighted or myopic. And if you look at the more broader impact of the idea of human rights, you would find that there's strong evidence that international human rights regime has served a lot of good in many parts of the world. And people like Beth Simmons, Catherine Sicking, argue for the continuation of international human rights efforts. Now, so turning to, and I will say a little bit more about this hope or despair aspect of the international human rights efforts. Turning back to Japan, right? So in Japan, the era of global human rights, the exposure to international human rights principles began in earnest in the 1970s. The Japanese government ratified the two key international covenants in 1979, signaling really ushering in the era of global human rights in Japan. And since then, the government has officially participated in other important international forums like the UN Commission on Human Rights, now reorganized into Human Rights Council, and the UN Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, another important institution for human rights at the UN. I'm not saying too many, discussing too many other forums, but across different institutions, Japan's participation expanded since the 70s. Okay, so how did that impact minorities in Japan? So I'm going to start with Ainu, which is a group concentrated mostly in Hokkaido. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but Hokkaido is a big island in the north. And they lived in the northern tip of mainland Japan for centuries, and they got pushed farther and farther to the north. And by the time of the mid-19th century, when the Meiji Restoration started, they were mostly concentrated in the big island of Hokkaido. So the Japanese government quickly incorporated Hokkaido into the Meiji government. The Meiji Restoration is 1867-68. And by 1869, the modern Japanese government declared Hokkaido part of Japan, which was an important thing because Russia was already there hanging out and trying to claim some of the territory there. And they quickly realized that, well, they knew that there are indigenous people living there, and Ainu people. But they sent a lot of mainland Japanese, the new government, Meiji government sent a lot of mainland Japanese to develop, quote unquote, the big island of Hokkaido. And Ainu people were incorporated into that regime, and they were forced to drop their traditional cultural practices. They lost their lands, and they were pushed into, they were forced to transform themselves into farmers. They were more of a hunting and gathering communities, but the Meiji government pushed them to become farmers. All of that didn't go well, as you might imagine, and they found Ainu were forced into severe poverty, and by any metrics, health, economic, political, they were a subjugated minority group. And the government did do something about it, passing a law in 1899 to provide some welfare to Ainu called the former Aborigines Protection Act. It's an English translation. In Japanese, it's called Kyudojin Hogoho, which has an even, Aborigines probably have somewhat negative connotation in English, but the Japanese word has even more derogatory implications. So clearly the Japanese government saw them as backward people in need of modernization. And Japan as a whole is turning into a modern nation, trying to compete with Western powers. And then, so around that time, there was not that much political activism by Ainu. They were just too subjugated to really bring themselves to do any kind of political activism. There was maybe some cultural associations, but not that much of a political activity. Then World War II happened and it ends. And in 1946, brimming with hope for a new democratic Japan, Ainu people got together and formed Hokkaido Ainu Association, the first Hokkaido-wide, all the Ainu in Hokkaido participated in this organization. And there was some excitement about engaging in some claim making against the Japanese government, but soon they were kind of co-opted into becoming a funnel organization for what little welfare the Japanese government provided. So their political activities fizzled out quickly, and also the post-World War II Japan was dominated by this ideology of homogeneous Japan. Pre-war Japan was a multi-ethnic empire, But post-war Japan is the primary ethnic and racial ideology in Japan was that Japan is homogeneous. So there was a strong pressure to assimilate into mainstream Japanese, and Ainu were dependent on government welfare. So there was very little ethnic, much less indigenous pride among Ainu to assert even their cultural difference. For them, Ainuness was, for Ainu people, Ainuness was something that they thought they're better off hiding. So they try to become assimilated into mainstream Japanese. Okay? So there's a clear lack of indigenous pride demonstrated in the name change for the organization. In 1961, the organization, Hokkaido Ainu Association, changed its name into Hokkaido Utari Association. So Ainu is in Ainu language, it means human. Neutral term, but they thought that only attracted negative attention because mainstream Japanese use the term Ainu in a derogatory tone, in a way. So they changed the organizational name into Hokkaido Utari Association. Utari meaning brothers and sisters and camaraderie and so on, also a neutral term. But Ainu is also a neutral term in Ainu language, okay? But they just wanted to get away from that label. So that's really indicative of how far they would go to hide their Ainuness. Now things changed in the 70s. 70s is when indigenous rights activism globally, indigenous rights, indigenous people's reawakening took place and led by American and European and some Asian minority indigenous peoples, global activities expanded dramatically. And there was accompanying development in the United Nations as well, establishing some forums for indigenous rights. But on a more civil society level, there was a lot of cultural exchange activities by indigenous peoples, and Ainu soon got engulfed in these activities, started participating in those events. And those events are on the surface cultural events, cultural exchange events. So they would get together, and as you see like in these photos, they would sort of demonstrate their traditional cultures, wearing traditional costumes and performing traditional dance and music and so on. But on the side, they would look at the host groups' ways of life and learn about how they lived in terms, politically, economically, and culturally. And as they talked to each other about the cultures they lost, lands that were taken away, they soon learned that these are very common experiences among all these subjugated groups in the world. And they started to form more of a union in the United Nations and on a civil society level, and started claiming indigenous rights. This idea of indigenous rights really took off in this period. And Ainu went to a lot of these activities and learned a lot from those people. And Ainu activists who were really shied away from asserting their Ainuness, they went to these places and learned about how like Inuit in Alaska lived and indigenous people in Canada lived, and realized that in their indigenousness, their Ainuness is not something that they have to hide. They can exhibit their culture very publicly and then be proud of that. And also they can claim some of the lands and cultures and resources that they lost in the process of Japan's modernization. So there are some quotes of Ainu activists who went to these trips and interacted with indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. Like this Ainu activist in 1978 went to Alaska and really shocked to find that the mayor of the city, Barrow, is himself an indigenous person. And the mayor told Ainu representative that you really need to start asserting, making political claims, or otherwise you will forever be dependent on government welfare and stay as a second or third class citizen. The second example is from Canada, where the Ainu activists landed on the Vancouver airport, and a beautiful modern international airport. And indigenous people there performed the traditional dance in their traditional costume to greet and welcome Ainu representatives, which was shocking to them. the contrast of this modern airport and this traditional indigenous people's culture was very new to Ainu, who thought that this is something, their indigenous culture is something that's unfit to exist in modern society. So their perception changed, and then they brought back their new understanding about their indigenousness, and also that understanding about how and what kind of political claims to make. And in 1984, they passed a proposal, the Hokkaido Butarian Association, really for the first time, started taking a stance of needing, that they declared that they would be in favor of a new law on Ainu that would replace this 1899 Former Aborigines Protection Act, which was still in existence. And the Japanese government around the same time ratified the International Covenant, two covenants, one of which is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And when a government ratifies a treaty, the government is required to submit periodic reports. And the Japanese government diligently submitted its first report to the UN Human Rights Committee, which is the monitoring body of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in the report, in the first periodic report to the Human Rights Committee, the government claimed that there are no ethnic minorities. They just don't exist. Each government has to report on all the 53 articles of the covenant. And Article 27, I think, is about ethnic minorities. And the report is examined by committee members, and some committee members were informed about minorities in Japan, like Ainu, and they asked the government representative about Ainu, and the response by the government official was that they have been completely assimilated. So there used to be some people like that, Ainu or Utari, but they have basically disappeared as a distinct group. Okay, that, as shocking as that may have been, that really didn't become any news. Nobody really knew what to do with it, and news media didn't pick up on it too much. So it was kind of buried. But then in 1986, Ainu encountered this golden opportunity to revive that problematic statement. This is the mid-90s, at the height of the bubble economy in Japan, and Japan Inc. was gobbling up Rockefeller Center and Hollywood studios and Pebble Beach golf course and so on. And at this hubris of the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Nakasone, is really amusing at this point. He said, Japan is a homogeneous nation, and that's why Japan is so successful. And it's hard for countries like the US, which is ethnically diverse, to reach the sort of economic success of Japan, right? And at the time, Japan was doing much better economically. So that's the context in which that comment came. And obviously that this comment elicited strong reaction in the US, didn't help with trade friction between the two countries, but also in Japan, Ainu was among the first to criticize Prime Minister Nakasone for his comment. And Ainu went to the United Nations to report on the problem. There is a procedure called 1503 procedure, and it's a procedure established early on to enable individuals who face systematic human rights violations to write directly to appeal to the United Nations. And Ainu used that channel to ask the United Nations to do something about this problematic statement. And that was assisted. Ainu didn't know what to do and was kind of reluctant initially to directly criticize Prime Minister of Japan. But groups like an NGO in Japan, Shimin Gaiko Center, Citizens Diplomacy Center, the activists in that organization helped Ainu Association, Butarian Association make that claim. And also there was a very important Japanese human rights advocate, Yo Kubota, who worked as an official at the UN Human Rights Center, today's Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. And those people helped Ainu connect with international human rights forums. And Ainu learned a lot about these forums and started participating in them. And at that time, the most important indigenous rights forum was the UN Working Group on indigenous populations. So they participated in the forum in '87, and they ever since then, every year they participated in this WGIP, as well as all the other important indigenous rights institutions, forums at the United Nations. And they continue to press on. They were encouraged that these kinds of claims in the UN actually elicited some reaction from the Japanese government and the Japanese public. So they kept pressing on. In 1992, the photo on the top right is a speech made by the director of the Ainu Association, then Butarian Association, Giichi Nomura, who made this speech at the UN General Assembly at the launching of the International Year of the World Indigenous People, which started in 1993. And it was very important that, symbolically important that Ainu leader was given this forum, because General Assembly is where heads of sovereign states give speeches, right? And the photo on the bottom, not great resolution, is a street protest in Tokyo, I believe, featuring then Nobel Peace Prize winner Rigoberta Menchú, women's rights and indigenous rights activist from Guatemala, who won the Nobel Peace Prize award that year. She was there in solidarity with Ainu and advocating for Ainu rights, indigenous rights in Japan. So all these domestic mobilization continued on, and the government had to respond to it, and it reacted by first recognizing Ainu as a distinct group in the working group on the indigenous population in 1987. And in 1991, in the third report to the Human Rights Committee, if you remember, the first report said there are no ethnic minority groups in Japan. By then, the government recognized Ainu as an ethnic minority group, not quite indigenous people, but it was some progress. And then Ainu pressed on, and by 1997, the Japanese government passed a law, Ainu Cultural Promotion Law, to replace the 1899 Former Aborigines Protection Act. And this law had some significant budget to promote and protect Ainu culture. Ainu made a lot of other claims, like political, economic, and other more claims for autonomy, but only cultural component was adopted. So it wasn't entirely satisfactory for Ainu, but they took it because it still is a recognition of Ainu as a different group that is deserving, whose culture is deserving of protection with the government's budget. But they really wanted to be recognized as an indigenous people, so they pressed on. And the Japanese government's response was that, Ainu people claim that they are an indigenous people, but we really don't know what that means because there's no internationally agreed upon definition of what an indigenous people is. So when, and at the time, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was in the works, it was being drafted. So the government stance was that once that declaration is adopted at the United Nations, then we'll move forward with the recognition of Ainu as an indigenous people. And to its credit, the DRIP, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, was adopted in the UN in 2007. And to its credit, the Japanese government quickly passed a resolution the year after that, recognizing Ainu as an indigenous people. And then they, typical of the Japanese government, they had meetings after meetings, spent 10 years to decide what would come out of that recognition. But they did pass a new law on Ainu in 2019, legislatively, officially recognizing Ainu as an indigenous people. And also, just a few months ago, several months ago, they opened, the government funded Ainu sort of cultural park, opened with Ainu individual leadership and input, opened in 2020. So there's some pretty significant progress. I'm not suggesting that everybody, all the Ainu people are happy in Hokkaido with those changes, but relative to where they were, this, as you can see, is a significant change. And to close the circle, in 2009, Hokkaido Butarian Association, if you remember, they changed the name from Hokkaido Ainu Association to Hokkaido Butarian Association, thinking that Ainu-ness is something to hide. They returned to the original name Hokkaido Ainu Association, reclaiming their pride in Ainu-ness. That's the history, that's the story of Ainu. Naomi, how am I doing on time? I don't know if I have enough time to go over the Korean case.
About 15 minutes.
I have 15 minutes to go?
Yes.
Oh, good, perfect. Okay, then I'll go quickly with Koreans in Japan. The Koreans in Japan are the immigrant, colonial era immigrants and their descendants who came to Japan or brought to Japan with increasingly forceful means toward the end of the war, World War II. And at the end of the war, they were quote unquote liberated. And that was clearly a very happy occasion for many Koreans in Japan, but also they lost all their rights that they had because of their citizenship in Japan. They were citizens of Japan, and although discriminated and disadvantaged as a citizen of the Japanese Empire, they enjoyed all the basic citizenship rights there. That they lost all of that. So their very existence in Japan is really in jeopardy. They mobilized for a lot of different rights, but I'm gonna focus on the fingerprinting practice, a civil rights issue, because that's the most infamous symbol of discrimination. A lot of activism focused on this issue because it was seen as the pivot that holds discriminatory governance institutions against Koreans in Japan. Clearly, Koreans were not happy with this practice, and there was some mobilization, but mostly to really prevent worsening of the practice, kind of reactive mobilization. And they cooperated reluctantly to this practice, partly because they had to do it, otherwise they would face the potential of deportation, or if they leave Japan, re-entry was always questionable if you don't comply with the requirement. The fingerprinting practice was part of the requirement of the important part of the requirement for alien registration, foreigner registration in Japan. There are a few reasons why Koreans did not mobilize very aggressively. One is that they were not citizens, and at the time, up until the 70s, despite the Universal Declaration, the dominant theory about ideology about rights was that citizens have some fundamental rights, right? So it's a citizenship rights regime. So if somebody is not a citizen, right? Koreans were non-citizens. For them, they just don't deserve most of the fundamental rights. That was the understanding, not just by the Japanese government or the Japanese public, but also many significant portion of Koreans shared this understanding. And part of that is related to the second reason for non-action, commitment to the homeland. At the time, a lot of Koreans thought that they would, even after the Korean War, they would go back to the reunited Korea at some point in their life. So they were more committed to the homeland of the Korean Peninsula, and they saw obtaining rights in Japan as betrayal to the homeland. So they were very hesitant, especially the older first generation, second generation Koreans in Japan were reluctant to do that, to pursue more rights in Japan. Also, there were significant divisions, as I said, generational divisions, but also North-South conflict was significant. They see each other with deep suspicion, reflecting the divide in the peninsula. So they couldn't really put up a united front and mobilize collectively, effectively. And obviously, Koreans and Japanese, also there was significant tension, and the Japanese public was not eager to support Koreans' rights in Japan either. So these hurdles were pretty formidable, but things changed again in the 70s with the beginning of international human rights era in Japan. In 1980, the very first refusal of this practice, fingerprinting, was done by Han Chon-suk in the photo at the bottom. This went without much notice at first, and he was not connected to any group, North Korean or South Korean group. He just did it based on his belief. And he was always troubled by this practice, but he couldn't really articulate why this is problematic. And then the Japanese government ratified the International Covenant. Really, that gave him sort of external legitimation because international covenants specify equality of citizens and non-citizens. So he now can say that this is a violation of this international law that Japan is committed to. And that's, according to his statements then, that was a big part of his refusal. The second refusal, Choi Chang-hwa, and his family unconnected to the first refusal. He was a student of international human rights law. He knew very well how that works, and he was waiting for the opportunity to refuse, and he did it in 1980, really soon after the first refusal, not knowing the first refusal, but around the same time. But again, his refusal didn't make much of a news in Japan, but his daughter, who's a teenager, had to go through this practice, and that was featured in the news, partly because Choi Chang-ho, being a savvy activist, brought the news media to the scene of this alien registration and fingerprinting. And this conversation between the section chief who asked for his daughter's fingerprinting and Mr. Choi Chang-ho is recorded on video. That's why we have this vivid dialogue here. So really, again, international covenants was the main legitimating factor that pushed Choi, that Choi used to push for the a refusal of fingerprinting. So that became news, and then the refusal movement really spread like wildfire. And by 1985, over 10,000 of about 360 resident aliens, Koreans in Japan, refused providing fingerprinting. The first dozen or so cases was they were all met by police arrest and other law enforcement measures. The Japanese government initially was trying to make an example of these refusers, demonstrating to others that they will be in trouble if they refuse. But by that time, by 1985, when 10,000 people refused, the police cannot really arrest all of them. So the movement really gained upper hand by then. And some of the quotes demonstrate how the language of global human rights really united both Northern and South Koreans in Japan, because it didn't matter whether they belong to North or South Korean. The human rights is universal. It's not citizenship rights. So their citizenship doesn't matter. And that's one reason why they could unite in this movement. And also Japanese public began to support this anti-fingerprinting movement by that time. And Koreans also went to the UN forum, and Choi Chang-ho, being a savvy activist, used the same procedure 1503 that Ainu used. And in this case, in Ainu's case, nothing really happened from that. But in this case, Japanese government was embarrassed because it was picked up by the UN Commission, and the government was examined. The case was examined officially, which is a rare occurrence for a developed country like Japan. It was mostly more underdeveloped countries that were examined, non-democratic countries. So government had to react to that. And Koreans pushed on using a lot of different channels in their connections to pressure the Japanese government to abolish the fingerprinting. And the government had to respond. And this is a good example of how the tone by the government changed very quickly after this 1981 examination of the 1503 procedure claims. Right before that, in the Diet is the national parliament in Japan, in the Diet discussion, the head of Immigration Control Office, 1980, stated that fingerprinting, there's a lot of controversy around it, but it is necessary to continue to have an effective alien registration process. That was a statement in 1980. Quickly after the 1981 examination, the government's position changed. Somebody in the same position, head of Immigration Control Office, stated in 1982 that, well, in light of this era of globalization and changing norms, we need to do something about this practice. Okay. So the revision of the fingerprinting practice started gradually and initially to reduce the pressure, psychological pressure on the Koreans. And finally, in 1993, the practice was terminated for permanent residents. And in 2000 for all alien residents, not just Koreans. Okay. So that's the death of the fingerprinting practice. I want you to conclude very quickly. So these two stories, I hope, demonstrated how global human rights really galvanized minority social movements in Japan by really empowering, that's the first point, is really something that I want to underscore, empowering local actors, in this case, Ainu and Koreans, with a new understanding about rights. They're placed in Japan, the rights that they're entitled to. They now had a new understanding after the 70s, new understanding about their rights, and that really gave them the courage and fortitude to press on with their activism. And international human rights forums also provided political opportunities. The Human Rights Committee, Commission on Human Rights, 1503 procedure, all these places were opportunities for minorities to pressure the Japanese government. And I didn't say too much, but I alluded to Citizens Diplomacy, Shimin Gaiko Center, Citizens Diplomacy Center, and Yo Kubota, who not only helped Ainu make their claims in the UN, but also Koreans as well. So these mobilizational resources, human resources, material resources, both, these flows of international mobilization resources were also helped by the expansion of global human rights. And also the way they framed their claims, Ainu framing their claim in indigenous rights terms. Those kinds of vocabularies also expanded as a result of the rise of global human rights in the world. And to wrap it up, so, should we have hope or despair in terms of the future of human rights in the world? I really want to underscore this importance of the empowering capacity of global human rights. That's often overlooked, especially in studies, political science kind of studies on human rights, skip over this aspect. But as I hope I demonstrated, this new understanding among marginalized populations that they deserve these rights for Ainu, that they didn't have to hide their Ainuness. They should be proud of their indigenous heritage. They should claim the lands they lost, cultures that they lost. That was really encouraged by the idea of human rights, universal human rights. And the second point is that it takes time. In both cases, it didn't happen overnight, right? Took years and decades. The same thing with African American activism in the U.S. civil rights movement. It didn't happen the next day. Rosa Parks refused to move, right? So it takes time, and one needs to understand some of the claims of end time of human rights and so on have some unreasonable expectations about how quickly things change. So as unsatisfactory as it might be for subjugated populations to be in the subjugated populations any longer, we have to have a reasonable understanding about how long it takes for those situations to change. And that's also important. And we're facing a significant backlash against international liberal norms, including human rights and democracy. That really poses a serious challenge going forward. And my view on that is that the 80s, 90s, those were the eras, and 2000s, periods when global institutions were established, and this more sort of top-down efforts of establishing these human rights ideas in international treaties and spreading these ideas in a top-down way to populations in the world. That era may be over. Now it's more of a term for bottom-up efforts to take over, to sustain global institutions. There's some, because of the apparent backing away from international institutions by the United States or United Kingdom, the stalwarts of post-World War II international liberal order, that really put these institutions in crisis. So I think it's a term for the bottom-up efforts. Activists all over the world, NGOs, civil society actors, if they keep trying to sustain global institutions of human rights, then we might get over this crisis and come out stronger out of that. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Tsutsui, for that wonderful talk. There's a lot of information that you covered about sort of how these global human rights initiatives are impacting minority groups on the ground in Japan in particular in your talk. And it was really enlightening. So thank you so much for sharing. We have had some excellent questions coming in. So first I'll go ahead and read this one that came in earlier. Could you elaborate on the shift from Japan as a multi-ethnic empire before World War II to Japan as a homogeneous society after the war? And how and why did this shift happen?
Well, that reflects the political reality of Japan, really. So before World War II, during the Japanese Empire period, Japan was expanding into Asia, competing with Western powers, and invading China and Korea and all those, and taking over Korea. And Japan had to have an ideology that justifies incorporating these territories in the world. And what came out of that is the emperor as a central, right, to the Meiji regime and Taisho and Showa regime. Emperor at the center, and all, they call it 8 different ethnic groups. All of them are equal under the emperor. That was the official ideology. Obviously, that wasn't the reality, right? Koreans are much more subjugated. Other Asians in other parts of Asia also were treated more or less as a second-class citizens of the Japanese empire. But that was the ideology, multi-ethnic empire of Japan. And then after 1945, Japan is defeated, the empire was defeated, and Japan loses all the territory. And so now the new Japan had to have a different perception about it. And then, this notion of homogeneous Japan was not non-existent prior to 1945, but it really became the dominant framework ideology racially, ethnically in Japan after 1945. And the reality of minority groups in Japan was completely put under the rug. And the dominant ideology was that Japan is a homogeneous nation, and expectation was that if there are any Ainu or any other minority group, they will become assimilated into mainstream Japanese culture, just like people in Fukuoka or Hiroshima became more like people in Tokyo. That was kind of the expectation at the time.
Great, thank you. Another question came in from Mariko. It states, lack of pride among the Ainu people was pointed out as one of the factors contributing to the marginalization of the Ainu. What role did public education play in this process? So how much of the segregating policy was embedded in the Japanese school curriculum at this time?
Great. So in Hokkaido, that's really where an obvious place where education on Ainu should take place. And there was really not that much of it. It's only after this era of human rights, indigenous rights, that school curriculum officially started talking about Ainu's contributions to Japan and their existence, the legitimacy of their existence in Japan. So education was lagging far behind, still is. Even today, outside of Hokkaido, there's not that much on Ainu that is in the school textbooks. It's not non-existent, but even some descriptions in Japanese textbooks or history or geography or geology, geography or whatever, I'm not quite sure how much of that is actually taught in the classroom, even if there's some description in the textbook. So education about Ainu, critically important, is lagging behind. There is an emphasis on human rights education. I didn't say too much about Burakumin, but Burakumin was very influential. So they pushed for all the, many of the municipal governments to incorporate human rights as a key component in their education. So especially in the parts where there are a lot of Burakumin in Japan, school curriculum would include some human rights education. But in those areas, Ainu is kind of like a distant thing. Hokkaido is far away from, say, Western metropolitan areas of Japan, where there are a lot of Burakumin and Koreans. So Ainu, I think it's fair to say Ainu is still under-taught in Japanese schools.
Thank you for sharing that. Another question that came in was about whether or not the Ainu were drafted into the military during World War II.
Yes, no, I mean, Ainu, Koreans, all of them. They were drafted, they served. And if you read documents that Ainu children wrote, or Ainu adults letters, they internalize the ideology that was sort of inculcated in them during the time. That you know, they want to die for the emperor, or they want to die for the empire, Japanese empire. They are a part of the Japanese empire, and they're very proud of that. So this inculcation of the ideology is very powerful, and Ainu fought in the war. Yes.
Thank you. Let's see, a question came in also that broadens the conversation a little bit, but have you seen socio-economic progress for the Ainu and the Zainichi as a result of their greater activism?
Yeah, so there's some data on that. I cite a couple of pieces in my book about Ainu's economic welfare. It's arguably slightly better than before, but still, they're on average, I forget the exact figure, but their income is generally lower than non-Ainu Japanese. And perhaps more important, their educational achievement tends to be lower. And a lot of Ainu individuals express concerns about their kids not adapting well at school. I mean, they're integrated into Japanese schools, go to the same school as mainstream Japanese. And some of them face a lot of, I mean, they speak Japanese, but in Japan, minor accent differences in the way they speak Japanese get picked up, and sometimes becomes basis for bullying and other things. So some Ainu children suffer from that sort of psychological problems because of that. So those are some of the concerns that really still remain. And Koreans, a lot of Koreans are actually entrepreneurs, and that's kind of by necessity. So they actually have, a lot of them are small business owners. So if you look at the average income and those kinds of metrics, it might not seem like Koreans are suffering in terms of their economic welfare, but a lot of these jobs are unstable. And job security is a major issue, because their path for desirable jobs, like in major corporations in Japan or government offices, for a long time they were denied access to these kinds of most desirable, most stable jobs. So in that area, they are particularly disadvantaged.
Thank you, Kiyo-sensei. There was a question that came in through the chat. It says, I learned a lot about the Ainu people in a manga called Golden Kamui, and heard about the Upoi Museum through the manga. I think individuals have played an important role in enlightening the public. What do you think should be the authorities' role in promoting the rights of Ainu or other minority ethnic groups in Japan?
That's wonderful. So Golden Kamui is a major hit. I actually haven't read it extensively, but I hear that you can probably tell me the depiction of Ainu is very fair and in a positive way. So that probably had a lot of good positive impact on the image of Ainu in Japan. I mean, even in the past, there were some portrayals of Ainu as kind of similar to Native Americans in the US. Some would portray Ainu as a sort of glorious group that is dying, but it has its distinct culture that should be valued. And there was some portrayal even prior to Golden Kamui, but that, I think, toward the mainstream Japanese public, that really I think helped elevate the image of Ainu. The question was authorities' role. So the government has invested in promoting and protecting Ainu culture, starting with the 1997 law, Ainu Cultural Promotion Law, and also now it opened this new museum, Ainu Museum in Hokkaido, which was, this was a major event. Celebrities came to AKB48 came to celebrate that occasion, and Prime Minister Suga, well, then Cabinet Secretary Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga, I believe, came. So this was a major event that attracted national attention. And my impression is that museum has been received well. It opened amid COVID-19 restrictions. So there were some challenges in making reservations to get in there and stuff like that. But in general, it was received well. So the authorities' role is, well, first of all, not to subjugate Ainu and Koreans anymore, but also to facilitate understanding of Ainu and other minorities in Japan, and to really promote their culture and recognize their contributions to Japan and what it is today. So that's, and then for Koreans, I would say that there's a massive number of Koreans, third, fourth generation Koreans, becoming naturalized Japanese citizens. And that was part of that is, main part of that is because it's become much easier to keep the Korean name. Before, I don't know, some couple decades ago, it was a lot more difficult because if a Korean resident of Japan wants to become a natural Japanese citizen, the Japanese government official would push him or her to adopt the Japanese name. A lot of Koreans use what's called tsumei, the Japanese sounding names, to pass as Japanese. And there was a lot of pressure to use that when they become Japanese citizen. But really, there was a lot of criticism for that, and the government changed its approach. And now there are a lot of legitimate Korean Japanese who maintains their Korean identity, uses a Korean name as a Japanese citizen. So that kind of thing would help Japan become more of a multicultural nation.
Great, thank you. And another question came in, if you wouldn't mind expanding a little bit more on the Ainu Museum. How did it come about? Was it grassroots mobilization from the Ainu community? Was it governmental pressure to acknowledge Ainu history and culture? How was it funded? Who operates it?
Yeah, it's completely funded by the government. And so it came about after the recognition, 2008, recognition of Ainu as an indigenous people. After the Diet, the Japanese Parliament, National Parliament, passed that resolution, it started having meetings. That's how the Japanese government often operates, is when there's a new sort of task, it keeps meeting. It takes forever and gets input from the experts. And it took over 10 years. But in those meetings, they discussed what should come out of this official recognition of Ainu as an indigenous people. And one of the things that arguably moved forward most quickly is the National Museum about Ainu. So that's where it came about. And the committees that kept meeting after 2008 resolution did include Ainu leaders. So there's greater legitimacy. It's not like the Japanese government decided to do this and without any input from Ainu. There was a great deal of input from Ainu. Now, some Ainu individuals, activists, criticized this process because not all the Ainu leaders were included, right? So Ainu leaders that represent the Hokkaido Ainu Association were included. But Hokkaido Ainu Association still is seen as more closer to the Japanese government. So more radical Ainu activists would still criticize this. But overall, my impression is Ainu people welcomed this museum that really instills pride, especially among young Ainu people, pride in Ainu-ness. And it's done, from what I hear, it's done really well. It's not like some really quick job of putting some artifacts of Ainu. It's like a multi-dimensional, multimedia kind of museum, interactive component, a top-notch technology involved. So it's being received well, and I think it also created employment for Ainu individuals. So there are a lot of people who work in the museum are Ainu individuals. So I'm not suggesting this is perfect, and this should be the last thing that the government would do for Ainu, but it's been received reasonably well. It's my impression, at least.
Great, thank you so much. There are a few questions that have come up about Zainichi and then also about Burakumin. So I'll start with one on Zainichi since you were able to speak about that. Could you talk a little bit more about what rights were denied the Zainichi when their citizenships were revoked?
Well, basically all the rights. So the Japanese government officials stated around that time that the government can boil or bake foreigners as it pleases, meaning foreigners here really refer directly to Koreans. So the government's perspective is that they're not Japanese citizens and they're in Japan, but they don't have any basis for being in Japan. So the government can do whatever it wants to these people, mass deportation or whatever. So they didn't really have any rights. But the reality was that they were there. And especially after, there was a massive return to the Peninsula movement right after the war, and many people returned. But there were a lot of long-term, right, Korean residents in Japan, and they had their bases in Japan, so they stayed. And also a lot of them came back after the Korean War because the peninsula was not a stable place. And there was, again, a return movement to North Korea because North Korea was initially seen as the more desirable of the two. South Korea was seen as a military dictatorship, which it was. So the return to North Korea movement also was strong up until the 60s, but then reality of North Korea was learned soon. So that also fizzled out. So many Koreans stayed in the end. And the government, the government might say that it can, bake or boil Koreans as it wishes, but it wouldn't do that, right? So there had to be some kind of compromise. So even though they had no rights really to be in Japan, Koreans were still there and earning their livelihood. And the fingerprinting practice was so important because it's part of the alien registration. So Koreans would do things in Japan, engage in economic activities and so on, but they had to be registered as an alien existence in Japan. And Koreans were, as I said, initially somewhat okay with it, not happy, but they thought they would go back to the peninsula. So they kind of reluctantly accepted that reality. And the government also was thinking that these people might be here for a little while, but eventually they will go back. So there's this amorphous kind of understanding, mutual understanding that went on for a long time. And then by the 70s, it came to a head. And Koreans' movement to gain more rights started in earnest in that time. So I don't know if I answered the question, but that's kind of like basically the answer is the Koreans lost really all the rights that they had as citizens of the Japanese Empire.
Thank you. We are just almost out of time here. I would like to ask a question. This may end up being our last question of the evening, but a question came through. Let me see here. Oh, I just lost it. Where did it go? Oh, here. In addition to your book, what are some key source materials in English and Japanese for learning about the Burakumin situation?
There have been some past publications. And there's, I'm blanking on the names of the authors. I think I cite many of them in my book. I'm not trying to promote my book, but I cite some of them. Eric Bondi, I think. There's actually there's been a flurry of ethnography on Burakumin lives and history and historical studies in the last 10 years or so. So in English. So those might be really a good place to go. Some people go to the 1970s publication, Wagatsuma, and I forgot the other name. That most Burakumin activists in Japan see that as problematic. So I wouldn't recommend that one. But so these recent books, I think John Lee, UC Berkeley sociologist, has a book, Multi-Ethnic Japan, also touches on Burakumin. I think there's an English translation of a book, Introduction to Burakumin, published by a very prominent Japanese scholar of Burakumin that came out. I'm not sure if I'm helping. I can, if that person leaves an email address or something, I can send more of a citations. I'm just blanking on the names. Sorry.
Okay, no, that sounds great. And then just one final question to conclude is a little bit more about sort of the Japanese public perceptions and perspectives on these issues. Global human rights empowered the minority groups in Japan and forced the government to change its policies. But what about their influence on the general Japanese public? Do you think that Japanese people have become more aware of and willing to support the minority people's rights? You know, and what factors are necessary for the Japanese society to become more inclusive and accepting of diversity?
Yeah, so I painted a pretty rosy picture here. The book is more nuanced, but and I didn't say too much about the backlash against all three groups, but there have been significant, really significant backlash against the three groups. I mean, Burakumin, Koreans, Ainu. There are conservative groups that criticize them of enjoying quote unquote privileges. So there's, I mean, some of them, most of them are seen as like hate groups. And it's not a huge portion of the Japanese public, but those groups exist. And I'm a little worried that these groups might be similar to the last 4 years in the US, might be gaining more traction. I don't see a strong piece of evidence on that. Like the anti-Korean group kind of peaked in the 2000s, I thought. May or may not come back. Anti-Burakumin kind of backlash also peaked, even a little earlier. Anti-Ainu backlash is actually now kind of, it came later, but it's kind of emerging, and some people in Hokkaido, politicians, conservative politicians, arguing that oh, there's no such thing as Ainu. It's kind of like a fake news hoax that is established to give these people more money or something like that. These kinds of arguments still exist. There's similar to any other democratic societies, we always have to be on guard because these ideas come back. A lot of mainstream Japanese who sympathize with these kinds of backlash arguments feel themselves are marginal. They are marginalized, and they are not getting any help from the government. When Ainu, Koreans, Burakumin are getting some kind of welfare from the government. I think you can see the parallel in the United States, right? So that is a concern going forward. So that's why it's critically important for the younger generation, the students that you teach, have a good understanding of universal human rights, where it came from, why it's important. I appreciate all your efforts day in and day out.
Thank you so much, Professor Tsutsui, for your talk tonight and for sharing so much insight with us about your research. And you've given us a lot to think about as sort of the global human rights initiatives and movements shape local policies and politics in Japan and around the world. So thank you so much. It's been an honor to share this Human Rights Day 2020 with you. And I appreciate the opportunity to reflect on many of these important issues with you. So thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
And thank you, teachers and attendees, for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time, as I mentioned. Hang in there. Vaccines hopefully are on the way, and I hope that everyone is staying healthy and well. And for those of you who are teaching right now, thank you for all of the hard work that you are putting in with your students virtually and in person, if you're able to do that. And all of us at SPICE just send you our best wishes. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please take care.